This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 15. Rewards. With the realization that Dejah Thoris was no longer within the throne room, came the belated recollection of the dark face that I had glimpsed peering from behind the draperies that backed the throne of Silencis Ol, at the moment I had first come so unexpectedly upon the strange scene being enacted within the chamber. Why had the sight of that evil countenance not warned me to greater caution? Why had I permitted the rapid development of new situations to efface the recollection of that menacing danger? But, alas, vain regret would not erase the calamity that had befallen. Once again had Dejah Thoris fallen into the clutches of that arch-fiend Thurid, the black tutor of the firstborn. Again was all my arduous labor gone for naught. Now I realized the cause of that rage that had been writ so large upon the features of Mata Shang, and the cruel pleasure that I had seen upon the face of Feodor. They had known or guessed the truth, and the Hecador of the Holy Therns, who had evidently come to the chamber in the hope of thwarting Silencis Ol in his contemplated perfidy against the high priest who coveted Dejah Thoris for himself, realized that Thurid had stolen the prize from beneath his very nose. Feodor's pleasure had been due to her realization of what this last cruel blow would mean to me, as well as to a partial satisfaction of her jealous hatred for the Princess of Helium. My first thought was to look beyond the draperies at the back of the throne, for there it was that I had seen Thurid. With a single jerk I tore the priceless stuff from its fastenings, and there before me was revealed a narrow doorway behind the throne. No question entered my mind, but that here lay the opening of the avenue of escape which Thurid had followed, and had there been, it would have been dissipated by the sight of a tiny, jeweled ornament which lay a few steps within the corridor beyond. As I snatched up the bauble, I saw that it bore the device of the Princess of Helium. Then, pressing it to my lips, I dashed madly along the winding way that led gently downward toward the lower galleries of the palace. I had followed but a short distance when I came upon the room in which Solon formerly had held sway. His dead body still lay where I had left it, nor was there any sign that another had passed through the room since I had been there, but I knew that two had done so, Thurid the black tutor and Dejah Thoris. For a moment I paused uncertain as to which of the several exits from the apartment would lead me upon the right path. I tried to recollect the directions which I had heard Thurid repeat to Solon, and at last, slowly, as though through a heavy fog, the memory of the words of the firstborn came to me. Follow a corridor passing 3 diverging corridors upon the right, then into the 4th right-hand corridor to where 3 corridors meet. Here again follow to the right, hugging the left wall closely to avoid the pit. At the end of this corridor I shall come to a spiral runway which I must follow down instead of up. After that the way is along but a single branchless corridor, and I recalled the exit at which he had pointed as he spoke. It did not take me long to start upon that unknown way, nor did I go with caution, although I knew that there might be grave dangers before me. Part of the way was black as sin, but for the most it was fairly well lighted. The stretch where I must hug the left wall to avoid the pits was darkest of them all, and I was nearly over the edge of the abyss before I knew that I was near the danger spot. A narrow ledge, scarce a foot wide, was all that had been left to carry the initiated past that frightful cavity into which the unknowing must surely have toppled at the first step. But at last I had won safely beyond it. Then a feeble light made the balance of the way plain, until, at the end of the last corridor, I came suddenly out into the glare of day upon a field of snow and ice. Clad for the warm atmosphere of the hothouse city of Cadabra, the sudden change to arctic frigidity was anything but pleasant. But the worst of it was that I knew I could not endure the bitter cold, almost naked as I was, and that I would perish before ever I could overtake Thurid and Dejah Thoris. To be thus blocked by nature, who had had all the arts and wiles of cunning men pitted against him, seemed a cruel fate, and as I staggered back into the warmth of the tunnel's end, I was as near hopelessness as I ever have been. I had by no means given up my intention of continuing the pursuit, for if needs be I would go ahead, though I perished ere ever I reached my goal. But if there were a safer way, it were well worth the delay to attempt to discover it, that I might come again to the side of Dejah Thoris in fit condition to do battle for her. Scarce had I returned to the tunnel than I stumbled over a portion of a fur garment that seemed fastened to the floor of the corridor close to the wall. In the darkness I could not see what held it, but by groping with my hands I discovered that it was wedged beneath the bottom of a closed door. Pushing the portal aside, I found myself upon the threshold of a small chamber, the walls of which were lined with hooks, from which depended suits of the complete outdoor apparel of the yellow men. Situated as it was at the mouth of a tunnel leading from the palace, it was quite evident that this was the dressing-room used by the nobles leaving and entering the hothouse city, and that Thurid, having knowledge of it, had stopped here to outfit himself and Dejah Thoris before venturing into the bitter cold of the Arctic world beyond. In his haste he had dropped several garments upon the floor, and the telltale fur that had fallen partly within the corridor had proved the means of guiding me to the very spot he would least have wished me to have knowledge of. It required but the matter of a few seconds to don the necessary oryx-skin clothing, with the heavy, fur-lined boots that are so essential a part of the garmenture of one who would successfully contend with the frozen trails and the icy winds of the bleak northland. Once more I stepped beyond the tunnel's mouth to find the fresh tracks of Thurid and Dejah Thoris in the new-fallen snow. Now, at last, was my task an easy one, for though the going was rough in the extreme, I was no longer vexed by doubts as to the direction I should follow, or harassed by darkness or hidden dangers. Through a snow-covered canyon the way led up toward the summit of the low hills. Beyond these is dipped again into another canyon, only to rise a quarter-mile further on toward a pass which skirted the flank of a rocky hill. I could see by the signs of those who had gone before that when Dejah Thoris had walked she had been continually holding back, and that the black men had been compelled to drag her. For other stretches only his footprints were visible, deep and close together in the heavy snow, and I knew from these signs that then he had been forced to carry her, and I could well imagine that she had fought him fiercely every step of the way. As I came round the jetting promontory of the hill's shoulder, I saw that which quickened my pulse, and set my heart to beating high, for within a tiny basin between the crest of this hill and the next stood 4 people before the mouth of a great cave, and beside them upon the gleaming snow rested a flyer which had evidently but just been dragged from its hiding-place. The 4 were Dejah Thoris, Feodor, Thurid, and Mata Shang. The 2 men were engaged in a heated argument, the father of Thurns threatening, while the black scoffed at him as he went about the work at which he was engaged. As I crept toward them cautiously, that I might come as near as possible before being discovered, I saw that finally the men appeared to have reached some sort of compromise, for with Feodor's assistance they both set about dragging the resisting Dejah Thoris to the flyer's deck. Here they made her fast, and then both again descended to the ground to complete the preparations for departure. Feodor entered the small cabin upon the vessel's deck. I had come to within a quarter of a mile of them when Mata Shang espied me. I saw him seize Thurid by the shoulder, wheeling him around in my direction as he pointed to where I was now plainly visible. For the moment that I knew I had been perceived, I cast aside every attempt at stealth, and broke into a mad race for the flyer. The 2 redoubled their efforts at the propeller at which they were working, and which very evidently was being replaced after having been removed for some purpose of repair. They had the thing completed before I had covered half the distance that lay between me and them, and then both made a rush for the boarding ladder. Thurid was the first to reach it, and with the agility of a monkey clambered swiftly to the boat's deck, where a touch of the button controlling the buoyancy tanks sent the craft slowly upward, though not with the speed that marks the well-conditioned flyer. I was still some 100 yards away as I saw them rising from my grasp. Back by the city of Cadabra lay a great fleet of mighty flyers, the ships of Helium and Parth that I had saved from destruction earlier in the day, but before ever I could reach them, Theward could easily make good his escape. As I ran, I saw Mata Shang clambering up the swinging ladder toward the deck, while above him leaned the evil face of the firstborn. A trailing rope from the vessel's stern put new hope in me, for if I could but reach it before it whipped too high above my head, there was yet a chance to gain the deck by its slender aid. That there was something radically wrong with the flyer was evident from its lack of buoyancy, and the further fact that though Theward had turned twice to the starting lever, the boat still hung motionless in the air, except for a slight drifting with a low breeze from the north. Now Mata Shang was close to the gunwale. A long, claw-like hand was reaching up to grasp the metal rail. Theward leaned further down toward his co-conspirator. Suddenly a raised dagger gleamed in the upflung hand of the black. Down it drove toward the white face of the father of Therns. With a loud shriek of fear, the holy Hecador grasped frantically at that menacing arm. I was almost to the trailing rope by now. The craft was still rising slowly, the while it drifted from me. Then I stumbled on the icy way, striking my head upon a rock as I fell, sprawling, but an arm's length from the rope, the end of which was now just leaving the ground. With the blow upon my head came unconsciousness. It could not have been more than a few seconds that I lay senseless there upon the northern ice, while all that was dearest to me drifted further from my reach in the clutches of that black fiend. For when I opened my eyes, Theward and Mata Shang yet battled at the ladder's top, and the flyer drifted but 100 yards further to the south. But the end of the trailing rope was now a good 30 feet above the ground. Goaded to madness by the cruel misfortune that had tripped me when success was almost within my grasp, I tore frantically across the intervening space, and just beneath the rope's dangling end I put my earthly muscles to the supreme test. With a mighty cat-like bound I sprang upward toward that slender strand, the only avenue which yet remained that could carry me to my vanishing love. A foot above its lowest end my fingers closed. Tightly as I clung, I felt the rope slipping through my grasp. I tried to raise my free hand to take a second hold above my first, but the change of position that resulted caused me to slip more rapidly toward the end of the rope. Slowly I felt the tantalizing thing escaping me. In a moment all that I had gained would be lost. Then my fingers reached a knot at the very end of the rope and slipped no more. With a prayer of gratitude upon my lips, I scrambled upward toward the boat's deck. I could not see Theward or Mata Shang now, but I heard the sounds of conflict, and thus knew that they still fought, the Thern for his life, and the black for the increased buoyancy that relief from the weight of even a single body would give the craft. Should Mata Shang die before I reached the deck, my chances of ever reaching it would be slender indeed, for the black Dator need but cut the rope above me to be freed from me forever. For the vessel had drifted across the brink of a chasm into whose yawning depths my body would drop to be crushed to a shapeless pulp should Theward reach the rope now. At last my hand closed upon the ship's rail, and that very instant a horrid shriek rang out below me that sent my blood cold and turned my horrified eyes downward to a shrieking, hurtling, twisting thing that shot downward into the awful chasm beneath me. It was Mata Shang, holy Hecador, father of Therns, gone to his last accounting. Then my head came above the deck, and I saw Theward, dagger in hand, leaping toward me. He was opposite the forward end of the cabin, while I was attempting to clamber aboard near the vessel's stern. But a few paces lay between us. No power on earth could raise me to that deck before the infuriated black would be upon me. My end had come. I knew it. But had there been a doubt in my mind, the nasty leer of triumph upon that wicked face would have convinced me. Beyond Theward I could see my Dejah Thoris, wide-eyed and horrified, struggling at her bonds. That she should be forced to witness my awful death made my bitter fate seem doubly cruel. I ceased my efforts to climb across the gunwale. Instead, I took a firm grasp upon the rail with my left hand and drew my dagger. I should at least die as I had lived, fighting. As Theward came opposite the cabin's doorway, a new element projected itself into the grim tragedy of the air that was being enacted upon the deck of Mata Shang's disabled flyer. It was Feodor. With flushed face and dishevelled hair, and eyes that betrayed the recent presence of mortal tears above which this proud goddess had always held herself, she leaped to the deck directly before me. In her hand was a long, slim dagger. I cast a last look upon my beloved princess, smiling, as men should who are about to die. Then I turned my face up toward Feodor, waiting for the blow. Never have I seen that beautiful face more beautiful than it was at that moment. It seemed incredible that one so lovely could yet harbor within her fair bosom a heart so cruel and relentless, and today there was a new expression in her wondrous eyes that I never before had seen there, an unfamiliar softness, and a look of suffering. Thurid was beside her now, pushing past to reach me first, and then what happened so quickly that it was all over before I could realize the truth of it. Feodor's slim hand shot out to close upon the black's dagger wrist. Her right hand went high with its gleaming blade. "That for Mata Shang," she cried, and she buried her blade deep in the Dator's breast. "That for the wrong you would have done Dejah Thoris," and again the sharp steel shank into the bloody flesh. "And that, and that, and that," she shrieked, "for John Carter, Prince of Helium." And with each word her sharp point pierced the vile heart of the great villain. Then, with a vindictive shove, she cast the carcass of the firstborn from the deck to fall in awful silence after the body of his victim. I had been so paralyzed by surprise that I had made no move to reach the deck during the awe-inspiring scene which I had just witnessed, and now I was to be still further amazed by her next act, for Feodor extended her hand to me and assisted me to the deck, where I stood gazing at her in unconcealed and stupefied wonderment. A wan smile touched her lips. It was not the cruel and haughty smile of the goddess with which I was familiar. "You wonder, John Carter," she said, "what strange thing has wrought this change in me. I will tell you. It is love, love of you." And when I darkened my brows in disapproval of her words, she raised an appealing hand. "Wait," she said, "it is a different love from mine. It is the love of your princess, Dejah Thoris, for you that has taught me what true love may be, what it should be, and how far from real love was my selfish and jealous passion for you. Now I am different. Now could I love as Dejah Thoris loves, and so my only happiness could be to know that you and she are once more united, for in her alone can you find true happiness. But I am unhappy because of the wickedness that I have wrought. I have many sins to expiate, and though I be deathless, life is all too short for the atonement. But there is another way, and if Feodor, daughter of the holy Hecador of the holy Therns, has sinned, she has this day already made partial reparation, and lest you doubt the sincerity of her protestation and her avowal of a new love that embraces Dejah Thoris also, she will prove her sincerity in the only way that lies open. Having saved you for another, Feodor leaves you to her embraces." With her last words she turned and leaped from the vessel's deck into the abyss below. With a cry of horror I sprang forward in a vain attempt to save the life that for 2 years I would so gladly have seen extinguished. I was too late. With tear-dimmed eyes I turned away that I might not see the awful sight beneath. A moment later I had struck the bonds from Dejah Thoris, and as her dear arms went about my neck and her perfect lips pressed to mine, I forgot the horrors that I had witnessed and the suffering that I had endured in the rapture of my reward. End of chapter 15.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg. Warlord of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 16. The New Ruler. The flyer, upon whose deck Dejah Thoris and I found ourselves after 12 long years of separation, proved entirely useless. Her buoyancy tanks leaked badly. Her engine would not start. We were helpless there in mid-air above the Arctic ice. The craft had drifted across the chasm which held the corpses of Mata Shang, Thurid, and Feodor, and now hung above a low hill. Opening the buoyancy escape valves, I permitted her to come slowly to the frozen ground, and as she touched, Dejah Thoris and I stepped from her deck and, hand in hand, turned back across the frozen waste toward the city of Cadabra. Through the tunnel that had led me in pursuit of them we passed, walking slowly, for we had much to say to each other. She told me of that last terrible moment months before, when the door of her prison cell within the Temple of the Sun was slowly closing between us; of how Phidor had sprung upon her with uplifted dagger, and of Thuvia's shriek as she had realized the foul intention of the Thurn goddess. It had been that cry that had rung in my ears all the long weary months that I had been left in cruel doubt as to my princess's fate, for I had not known that Thuvia had wrested the blade from the daughter of Matai Shang before it had touched either Dejah Thoris or herself. She told me too of the awful eternity of her imprisonment, of the cruel hatred of Phidor and the tender love of Thuvia, and of how even when despair was the darkest, those two red girls had clung to the same hope and belief, that John Carter would find a way to release them. Presently we came to the chamber of Solon. I had been proceeding without thought of caution, for I was sure that the city and the palace were both in the hands of my friends by this time. And so it was that I bolted into the chamber full into the midst of a dozen nobles of the court of Silenus all. They were passing through on their way to the outside world along the corridors we had just traversed. At sight of us they halted in their tracks, and then an ugly smile overspread the features of their leader. "The author of all our misfortunes," he cried, pointing at me. "We shall have the satisfaction of a partial vengeance at least, when we leave behind us here the dead and mutilated corpses of the Prince and Princess of Helium. When they find them," he went on, jerking his thumb upward toward the palace above, "they will realize that the vengeance of the Yellow Man costs his enemies dear. Prepare to die, John Carter, but that your end may be the more bitter, know that I may change my intention as to meeting a merciful death to your princess. Possibly she shall be preserved as a plaything for my nobles." I stood close to the instrument-covered wall, Dejah Thoris at my side. She looked up at me wonderingly as the warriors advanced upon us with drawn swords, for mine still hung within its scabbard at my side, and there was a smile upon my lips. The yellow nobles too looked in surprise, and then as I made no move to draw they hesitated, fearing a ruse, but their leader urged them on. When they had come almost within sword's reach of me I raised my hand and laid it upon the polished surface of a great lever, and then, still smiling grimly, I looked my enemies full in the face. As one they came to a sudden stop, casting affrighted glances at me and at one another. "Stop!" shrieked their leader. "You dream not what you do." "Right you are," I replied. "John Carter does not dream. He knows that should one of you take another step toward Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium, I pull this lever wide, and she and I shall die together, but we shall not die alone." The nobles shrank back, whispering together for a few moments. At last their leader turned to me. "Go your way, John Carter," he said, "and we shall go ours." "Prisoners do not go their own way," I answered, "and you are prisoners, prisoners of the Prince of Helium." Before they could make answer, a door upon the opposite side of the apartment opened, and a score of yellow men poured into the apartment. For an instant the nobles looked relieved, and then as their eyes fell upon the leader of the new party their faces fell, for he was Talu, rebel prince of Marentina, and they knew that they could look for neither aid nor mercy at his hands. "Well done, John Carter," he cried. "You turn their own mighty power against them. Fortunate for Okkar is it that you were here to prevent their escape, for these be the greatest villains north of the ice barrier, and this one," pointing to the leader of the party, "would have made himself Jeddak of Jeddaks in the place of the dead Silenus all. Then indeed would we have had a more villainous ruler than the hated tyrant who fell before your sword." The Okkarian nobles now submitted to arrest, since nothing but death faced them should they resist, and, escorted by the warriors of Talus, we made our way to the great audience chamber that had been Silenus' All's. Here was a vast concourse of warriors. Red men from Helium and Ptarth, yellow men of the north, rubbing elbows with the blacks of the firstborn who had come under my friend Xodar to help in the search for me and my princess. There were savage green warriors from the Dead Sea bottoms of the south, and a handful of white-skinned Therns who had renounced their religion and sworn allegiance to Xodar. There was Tardos Mors and Mors Kajak, and, tall and mighty in his gorgeous warrior trappings, Thoris, my son. These three fell upon Dejah Thoris as we entered the apartment, and though the lives and training of royal Martians tend not toward vulgar demonstration, I thought that they would suffocate her with their embraces. And there were Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, and Kantos Khan, my old-time friends, and leaping and tearing at my harness, in the exuberance of his great love, was dear old Woola, frantic mad with happiness. Long and loud was the cheering that burst forth at sight of us, deafening was the din of ringing metal as the veteran warriors of every Martian clime clashed their blades together on high in token of success and victory, but as I passed among the throng of saluting nobles and warriors, Jeds and Jeddaks, my heart was still heavy, for there were two faces missing that I would have given much to have seen there. Thuva Din and Thuvia of Tarth were not to be found in the great chamber. I made inquiries concerning them among men of every nation, and at last from one of the yellow prisoners of war I learned that they had been apprehended by an officer of the palace as they sought to reach the Pit of Plenty, while I lay imprisoned there. I did not need to ask to know what had sent them thither, the courageous Jeddak and his loyal daughter. My informer said that they lay now in one of the many buried dungeons of the palace, where they had been placed pending a decision as to their fate by the tyrant of the north. A moment later searching parties were scouring the ancient pile in search of them, and my cup of happiness was full when I saw them being escorted into the room by a cheering guard of honor. Thuvia's first act was to rush to the side of Dejah Thoris, and I needed no better proof of the love these two bore for each other than the sincerity with which they embraced. Looking down upon that crowded chamber stood the silent and empty throne of Okkar. Of all the strange scenes it must have witnessed since that long-dead age that had first seen a Jeddak of Jeddaks take his seat upon it, none might compare with that upon which it now looked down, and as I pondered the past and future of that long-buried race of black-bearded yellow men, I thought that I saw a brighter and more useful existence for them among the great family of friendly nations that now stretched from the South Pole almost to their very doors. 22 years before I had been cast, naked and a stranger, into this strange and savage world. The hand of every race and nation was raised in continual strife and warring against the men of every other land and color. To-day, by the might of my sword and the loyalty of the friends my sword had made for me, black man and white, red man and green, rubbed shoulders in peace and good fellowship. All the nations of Barsoom were not yet as one, but a great stride forward toward that goal had been taken, and now if I could but cement the fierce yellow race into this solidarity of nations, I should feel that I had rounded out a great life work, and repaid to Mars at least a portion of the immense debt of gratitude I owed her for having given me my Dejah Thoris. And as I thought, I saw but one way and a single man who could ensure the success of my hopes. As is ever the way with me, I acted then as I always act, without deliberation and without consultation. Those who do not like my plans and my ways of promoting them have always their swords at their sides wherewith to back up their disapproval, but now there seemed to be no dissenting voice, as, grasping Talus by the arm, I sprang to the throne that had once been Silenus' All's. "Warriors of Barsoom," I cried, "Kadabra has fallen, and with her the hateful tyrant of the north, but the integrity of Okkar must be preserved. The red men are ruled by red Jeddaks, the green warriors of the ancient seas acknowledge none but a green ruler, the firstborn of the South Pole take their law from black Xodar, nor would it be to the interests of either yellow or red man were a red Jeddak to sit upon the throne of Okkar. There be but one warrior best fitted for the ancient and mighty title of Jeddak of the North. Men of Okkar, raise your swords to your new ruler, Talu, the rebel prince of Marentina." And then a great cry of rejoicing rose among the free men of Marentina and the Cadabran prisoners, for all had thought that the red men would retain that which they had taken by force of arms, for such had been the way upon Barsoom, and that they should be ruled henceforth by an alien Jeddak. The victorious warriors who had followed Carthoris joined in the mad demonstration, and amidst the wild confusion and the tumult and the cheering, Dejah Thoris and I passed out into the gorgeous garden of the Jeddaks that graces the inner courtyard of the palace of Cadabra. At our heels walked Woola, and upon a carved seat of wondrous beauty beneath a bower of purple blooms we saw two who had preceded us, Thuvia of Ptarth and Carthoris of Helium. The handsome head of the handsome youth was bent low above the beautiful face of his companion. I looked at Dejah Thoris, smiling, and as I drew her close to me I whispered, "Why not?" Indeed, why not? What matter ages in this world of perpetual youth? We remained at Cadabra, the guests of Talu, until after his formal induction into office, and then, upon the great fleet which I had been so fortunate to preserve from destruction, we sailed south across the ice barrier, but not before we had witnessed the total demolition of the grim guardian of the North under orders of the new Jeddak of Jeddaks. "Henceforth," he said as the work was completed, "the fleets of the red men and the black are free to come and go across the ice barrier as over their own lands. The carrion caves shall be cleansed, that the green men may find an easy way to the land of the yellow, and the hunting of the sacred apt shall be the sport of my nobles until no single specimen of that hideous creature roams the frozen north." We bade our yellow friends farewell with real regret, as we set sail for Ptarth. There we remained, the guest of Thuvan Din, for a month, and I could see that Carthoris would have remained forever had he not been a prince of Helium. Above the mighty forests of Keal we hovered until word from Kulan Tith brought us to his single landing tower, where all day and half a night the vessels disembarked their crews. At the city of Keal we visited, cementing the new ties that had been formed between Keal and Helium, and then one long-to-be-remembered day we sighted the tall, thin towers of the twin cities of Helium. The people had long been preparing for our coming. The sky was gorgeous with gaily trimmed flyers. Every roof within both cities was spread with costly silks and tapestries. Gold and jewels were scattered over roof and street and plaza, so that the two cities seemed ablaze with the fires of the hearts of the magnificent stones and burnished metal that reflected the brilliant sunlight, changing it into countless glorious hues. At last, after 12 years, the royal family of Helium was reunited in their own mighty city, surrounded by joy-mad millions before the palace gates. Women and children and mighty warriors wept in gratitude for the fate that had restored their beloved Tardos Mors and the divine princess whom the whole nation idolized. Nor did any of us who had been upon that expedition of indescribable danger and glory lack for plaudits. That night a messenger came to me as I sat with Dejah Thoris and Carthoris upon the roof of my city palace, where we had long since caused a lovely garden to be made, that we three might find seclusion and quiet happiness among ourselves, far from the pomp and ceremony of court, to summon us to the Temple of Reward, where one is to be judged this night, the summons concluded. I racked my brain to try and determine what important case there might be pending which could call the royal family from their palaces on the eve of their return to Helium after years of absence, but when the Jeddak summons, no man delays. As our flyer touched the landing stage at the temple's top, we saw countless other craft arriving and departing. In the streets below a great multitude surged toward the great gates of the temple. Slowly there came to me the recollection of the deferred doom that awaited me since that time I had been tried here in the temple by Zat Aras for the sin of returning from the Valley Dor and the lost sea of Chorus. Could it be possible that the strict sense of justice which dominates the men of Mars had caused them to overlook the great good that had come out of my heresy? Could they ignore the fact that to me and me alone was due the rescue of Thoris, of Dejah Thoris, of Mors Kajak, of Tardos Mors? I could not believe it, and yet for what other purpose could I have been summoned to the Temple of Reward immediately upon the return of Tardos Mors to his throne? My first surprise as I entered the temple and approached the throne of righteousness was to note the men who sat there as judges. There was Culan Tith, Jeddak of Ceol, whom we had but just left within his own palace a few days since. There was Thuvan Din, Jeddak of Ptarth. How came he to Helium as soon as we? There was Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, and Xodar, Jeddak of the Firstborn. There was Talu, Jeddak of Jeddaks of the North, whom I could have sworn was still in his ice-bound hothouse city beyond the northern barrier, and among them sat Tardos Mors and Mors Kajak, with enough lesser Jeds and Jeddaks to make up the 31 who must sit in judgment upon their fellow man. A right royal tribunal indeed, and such a one, I warrant, as never before sat together during all the history of ancient Mars. As I entered, silence fell upon the great concourse of people that packed the auditorium. Then Tardos Mors arose. "John Carter," he said in his deep martial voice, "take your place upon the pedestal of truth, for you are to be tried by a fair and impartial tribunal of your fellow men." With level eye and high-held head I did as he bade, and as soon as I glanced about that circle of faces, that a moment before I could have sworn contained the best friends I had upon Barsoom, I saw no single friendly glance, only stern, uncompromising judges, there to do their duty. A clerk rose, and from a great book read a long list of the more notable deeds that I had thought to my credit, covering a long period of 22 years, since first I had stepped the ochre sea bottom beside the incubator of the Tharks. With the others he read of all that I had done within the circle of the Ots Mountains, where the holy Therns and the Firstborn had held sway. It is the way upon Barsoom to recite a man's virtues with his sins when he is come to trial, and so I was not surprised that all that was to my credit should be read there to my judges, who knew it all by heart, even down to the present moment. When the reading had ceased, Tardos Mors arose. "Most righteous judges," he exclaimed, "you have heard recited all that is known of John Carter, Prince of Helium, the good with the bad. What is your judgment?" Then Tarkas came slowly to his feet, unfolding all his mighty towering height until he loomed, a green bronze statue, far above us all. He turned a baleful eye upon me, he, Tarkas, with whom I had fought through countless battles, whom I loved as a brother. I could have wept had I not been so mad with rage that I almost whipped my sword out and had at them all upon the spot. "Judges," he said, "there can be but one verdict. No longer may John Carter be Prince of Helium." He paused. "But instead, let him be Jeddak of Jeddaks, Warlord of Barsoom." As the 31 judges sprang to their feet with drawn and upraised swords in unanimous concurrence in the verdict, the storm broke throughout the length and breadth and height of that mighty building, until I thought the roof would fall from the thunder of the mad shouting. Now at last I saw the grim humor of the method they had adopted to do me this great honor, but that there was any hoax in the reality of the title they had conferred upon me was readily disproved by the sincerity of the congratulations that were heaped upon me by the judges first, and then the nobles. Presently 50 of the mightiest nobles of the greatest courts of Mars marched down the broad Isle of Hope, bearing a splendid car upon their shoulders, and as the people saw who sat within, the cheers that had rung out for me paled into insignificance beside those which thundered through the vast edifice now, for she whom the nobles carried was Dejah Thoris, beloved Princess of Helium. Straight to the throne of righteousness they bore her, and there Tardos Mors assisted her from the car, leading her forward to my side. "Let a world's most beautiful woman share the honor of her husband," he said. Before them all I drew my wife close to me and kissed her upon the lips. End of chapter 16, and the end of Warlord of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain.